Okay, so let's, oh yeah, I wanted to recap. So obviously this episode 5, but it's very quick, easy to recap what we did so far. Basically, it's about rediscovering the sudo vulnerability that was found a few months ago. And we redo the steps as if we are the people that discover this vulnerability. I think that's a great way to learn because it kind of like, it puts you in the shoes as if you are the researcher. And what we did so far is we set up an environment to explore and research sudo. And then we wanted to start fuzzing it. And we chose AFL. And while we tried to instrument sudo with AFL, we ran into lots of different problems and issues why the fuzzing just didn't really work. And we even found a crash that happened in AFL, in an instrumentation of AFL. So, we didn't even find a crash in sudo yet. But basically last episode, we were able to set up a proper fuzzing experiment using actually 2 fuzzers. We used regular AFL and AFL++, which is a fork and improved some stuff on AFL. We used both, including, you have to give these fuzzers some initial test cases that they use then to mutate and fuzz stuff. And for one fuzzer, we gave it already the information that sudo edit is a functionality of sudo. And the other test case is very bare. There's no information about sudo edit, so the fuzzer has to discover this functionality by itself. So we ran this fuzzing experiment. And in this video, as you can see in the title, we did find a crash through fuzzing, and now we have to start analyzing this crash and figure out what exactly is this crash that we found in order to then, eventually lead to the exploitation. And in this video, I talk about the steps I did for if you find a crash input to minimize this crash input to have a very small test case that is much easier for you to understand and analyze what the root cause is. Anyway, let's get started. We set up a fuzzer experiment where we use AFL and AFL++ to fuzz sudo. These fuzzers started with some test cases given to them, and 2 test cases included the program name sudoedit, while the others only sudo. The vulnerability we are looking for is in sudoedit. So this is an interesting experiment. How quickly do the sudo-edit based fuzzers find the vulnerability, and how long does it take for a fuzzer that doesn't even have the initial information about sudo-edit need to find that particular functionality? So just, I don't know how basic or how much I want to comment on this or, tell me if it's dumb what I'm saying, but just for the people maybe that are not experienced with binary at all and are watching regardless, what you see here on the screen are basically 4 terminal windows that are running AFL, and AFL is the fuzzer. The top 2 are running regular AFL, and the bottom 2 are running the AFL fork, AFL++. So just to explain what this weird output is. It looks really fancy and cool. That's why I did like the overlay over my face there. And as explained, there's a bit of an experiment with if these fuzzers find the crash and so forth, but that's not that important. It's just important to know that this is the fuzzer output. Anyway, fuzzers have been running overnight now. Let's check their status. Oh, I just woke up. And of course, first thing is to check the fuzzers. We have found one crash. First of all, I would have expected that the sudo-edit fuzzers would have found a crash much faster, and I'm surprised that the AFL version didn't. Also, it's a bit of concern why this fuzzer is stuck with slow execution speed and large amounts of timeouts. While I quickly moved on from here and continued my research and investigation, I can tell you from the future that I have actually let this fuzzer run on the side for over a week or so, and eventually this fuzzer came out of its rut and got back some speed. But it's interesting how that happened. Also, the AFL++ fuzzer that only had a sudo test case and didn't know about sudoedit eventually found sudoedit. The last new part. So, here I was just telling you about my experience doing fuzzing. I've used AFL before, but I'm not like experienced or professional with it at all. So sudoedit was also an interesting project for me to dig a bit deeper and experiment a bit more with fuzzing. And that's why I set up this fuzzing experiment. These fuzzers are very intelligent because they look at the coverage of the code execution of the fuzzing target. So if they mutate the input and it executes a new function that wasn't executed before, it will recognize that they have reached new coverage, and so they can do some, selection. Oh, this one gave us new functionality. It's like a genetic algorithm. You have basically generations of inputs, and you can then try to select for those that created better coverage or more coverage and new coverage and so forth. And so it's kind of magical that you can give a fuzzer like this just a little bit of input, and based on wiggling around the bits and bytes and looking at the coverage, they eventually reach, a lot of different functionality of the program. And sudo in this special case has this thing where if you call it with the name sudo, it has different functionality than when you call it with the name sudo edit. And I wanted to see if a fuzzer can find sudo edit. And it's not a trivial task because it's a string with multiple bytes that need to be correctly this value. Otherwise, it will not find this this functionality. You have to imagine if you are flipping bits, it's not like if you flip one bit and it's a bit closer to the string sudo edit that it will realize this. If those whole bytes do not match, it will not find this functionality. There are actually a few strategies to kind of make that actually work this way. If you read the AFL++ README, you can find a bit information about different fuzzing strategies. That's something I probably will talk about at the very end of this series. I haven't gone this far with editing yet, but I've experimented with that myself. I had it letting fuzz on the side. But what I wanted to say is that just as an information how I made this series, I worked on this sudo edit project for roughly 3 weeks, very full-time, day and night, trying to rediscover and then exploit sudo edit. And I started collecting the footage during that time, and then after that I started writing the scripts, and after that I edited. So at the time of making this video, I knew already what the result was, and that's why I was able to tell you that after a week or so, I actually, found more crashes, and the other fuzzers found crashes and so forth. Okay, were there any questions about this yet? Why is it called American? This is just, I don't know exactly the origin story, but American Fuzzy Lob is a rabbit. That's where the name is from. I don't know what exactly the reference there is. This vulnerability, to which house of heap vulnerabilities come closest? So I don't know exactly what technique house of like the house stuff. I mean, I don't know precisely the techniques, but I know that you exploit the heap metadata and the heap algorithm. But this is not what you do here. Here you are basically exploiting just a regular overflow. You're just overflowing from one object into another object, and this other object has a special functionality that then can be used as a primitive to gain actual code execution. So it's not at all one of the house strategies, because those house strategies are more about actually exploiting the heap metadata and the next pointer and the previous pointer and these kind of things. So I would say no, it's not, but I'm not that experienced and familiar with the house thing that maybe there are some overlaps that I just don't realize in the moment. It just needs to end in edit. Yes, it has to end in edit. It has to have one character before it and then edit. But yeah, this is a lot of bytes that have to be very correct. And just by bit flipping and byte flipping, it's kind of rare to find this. It's 32-bit. Of bits that need to be correct in order to find this new functionality. With millions and millions of executions or billions of executions, you eventually will obviously find it. But if we look at here, so this fuzzing campaign was running now, now it's covered here. You can see it here for 6 hours. After 6.5 hours, this fuzzer found this crash, and it had 5.9 million executions. If you think about just like by probability. And I'm not sure if this works exactly this way, but this is how I explain it to myself. You know, the 32 bits are a few million attempts. How many million attempts is that? But, you know, you can think of it as chance, like, you know, to get these 32-bit correct. Like, it's like 32-bit brute forcing. But not only that, the AFL fuzzer will obviously explore a lot of different things. So you need a multiplier of 32 bits brute forcing basically to have guaranteed it be found by chance in this fuzzer. At least that's kind of how I think about it, and that kind of would explain, or this is how I explain to myself why a test case with only sudo without the edit after it took, you know, a week or so to find it, while the one that knew about sudo edit only needed 5 millions because they already had the sudo edit text, so they actually didn't have to find this new functionality, but it took then 5 million executions until it did find the crash. Okay, does that make sense? Counter-Stroke player, thanks for the Twitch Prime. Sounds like something that symbolic execution should be used for. Yeah, there are some strategies you could obviously do, but you know, it's a trade-off, I guess, between speed and so forth. But as I said, in AFL++, there are actually some strategies. It's called CompCov, I think, comparative coverage or something. CompCov, compare coverage for AFL++. That is so cool. I don't want to spoil it because I want to make a video about this, but that is basically the solution to this problem. It's really cool. I think it would be cool to dive deep into old malware code, like analyzing Stuxnet or maybe the SolarWinds malware, analyze exploit to see malware behavior. Yeah, that is definitely a really cool topic. Unfortunately, I don't know enough about it, but maybe, you know, if I could kind of collaborate maybe with some of these malware researchers. You know, it's difficult to understand Stuxnet. I mean, the part that the initial access, I think it was this LNK file exploit in Windows, that is probably easier to understand and demo and so forth. But then the actual payload, the stuff that interfaced with the centrifuge and stuff like this, I would have no clue how to look at that. Does AFL fuzz environment variables? Not by default. The same issue. Fuzzing sudo, the difficulty is to make it fuzz arguments, which is also not like a default setup for AFL. And that's why we had to, if you look into the files for this project, you can kind of follow along with the code. And there's this header file that basically, because AFL is fuzzing just input data, you just throw it a data blob, and it's basically intended for file parsers, programs that just take in a file and open it. But sudo obviously doesn't take a file, so you add this wrapper to basically take this file input, and it has a certain format. It's basically like a file format. It deciphers this format and turns that into fake arguments that are then being used inside of sudo. And that way AFL can fuzz the arguments. And now to fuzz environment variables, you have to do exactly the same thing. You would have to extend this code basically here to now also take environment variables into account. Fun fact, this is actually something I did all the way at the end. When I was completely done with this, I paid for a bigger server with 12 CPUs and decided I'm going to fuzz now up-to-date sudo, and I'm gonna include the environment variables as well. You know, I would like to announce that I found a 0-day, but unfortunately I did not so far. I didn't find anything. But yeah, in order to fuzz environment variables, you need to, add another wrapper around it. I wonder how long libafl would take, or competitive libafl already. Yes. That would be interesting. I think libafl would be interesting here and to implement, because, you know, it basically uses argv as kind of like a, I don't know, like, yes, I think that would be interesting to try. It would be so much faster for sure. And I would also be interested to use other fuzzers to fuzz exactly the same thing. And in one video, I asked if anybody has experience setting up, you know, libfuzzer or hongfuzz or, you know, whatever exists out there, for sudo as well. I think it would be very interesting to compare the setup and the performance and everything. But yeah, so far nobody has wrote me about it, so I don't know. How much did I spend so far? Is that a question about the server I got with the 12 cores? So the server costs 65 euros per month, and it's running now for 3 months or so. So this is how much I paid for 0 findings. I have to sneeze. Not anymore. Okay, anyway, sorry, we got so distracted with medical devices, and there's a question about starting studying. Sorry, let's go through this video and generic questions. Let's do this after this video, okay? Let's do only questions related to sudo and maybe fuzzing. Okay, so sudo edit.
The last new path times are also kinda high, over 1 hour here, which means the fuzzer hasn't found any new code functionality in over 1 hour, which can be an indication that maybe the fuzzer explored everything it could easily find. But it's hard to say if 1 hour is a lot or not for sudo. I lack the experience. Anyway, let's look into this crash. First, I want to check the crash input file itself and look at it with hexdump. I would have expected that it found a variant of the vulnerability with sudo edit -s or so, but apparently it didn't. However, this input does have a backslash, so maybe we found another variant to trigger the sudo edit bug? Or maybe this is a false positive and this is not really a crash.
When I actually had this crash the first time, I did not notice that there is a backslash in there. And if you look very closely, you can also see that it says here edit. And like I said, when I first saw this hex dump, I didn't really look where the 0 byte is to determine, you know, what is the program name, because it's a 0 byte separated list basically. So the 0 byte comes after the edit. So the whole, you know, all these first 3 lines are basically the program name and it ends in edit. So this is actually a valid sudo edit thing. But at the time, I thought it must be perfectly written as sudo edit. At the time, when I did this the first time, I did not know that only edit is enough. So when I saw this, I thought, whoa, what the fuck? I got a crash and it's not sudo edit. And for a moment, I really thought, oh, damn, did I find something new? And of course, through later analysis, I learned that it has to end in edit and that there was actually also a backslash. So, you know, you could have already noticed there that this is just a variant of the known sudo edit vuln.
So let's try it. I copy this crash to...
Yeah, I might have, I did probably explain this in the previous videos. As I said, like I did this research in like 3 weeks or so. And then afterwards I started working on these videos. So, you know, it's not like that I did this stuff here last week or so. That's why I have the knowledge of the future. I think it's a better way to do it this way, because then I can choose where do I bring you along, including my failures and my dead ends, but at the same time also make the decision which ones I think are good dead ends and which ones are not that important. And that's why I mentioned this earlier, because I think it makes more sense to have this mentioned so you understand this. Otherwise it will be very confusing, I think, throughout this series.
TMP crash, then I cut to send the file data as input to the instrumented AFL sudo binary, and we get a malloc error. Invalid next size unsorted, aborted. Now maybe this is just again a thing.
So again, here I'm doing like sanity checks. So I got this crash, and the first, I mean, AFL said it's a crash, but first I need to verify, is it really a crash? So I can pipe, or, you know, the way how this wrapper works is that it takes standard input, so it wants the crashing input as input. So I take the crash file, I pipe it again into sudo, and yes, indeed, like I can reproduce that there is a malloc abort, which is a symptom of a memory corruption that happened earlier. So this is, I mean, clearly this crash is triggering something. But there are a few more sanity checks we can make. especially with sudo, which is the special program that runs with setuid, and you know, if you execute it as root, it does different stuff than when you are an unprivileged user. So, you know, there are some uncertainties that you want to get rid of by doing some sanity checks. So here I'm just playing around using this crash input, throwing it at different, like throwing at it and see if it still crashes.
With our instrumented binary. So let's try it with our need AFL sudo wrapper, which sets up the arguments and calls the real installed sudo. And when we do that, we also get a malloc error.
So this is, you know, one of the sanity checks. So there's this wrapper AFL2 sudo, which you can also find on GitHub. And AFL2 sudo basically does what the wrapper AFL does as well. So we use this AFL wrapper. What this does is this function reads from standard input and overrides argv and you know, in this case only argv. So this way we can, you know, it ignores these argv. These argvs don't matter. So you can give it input as standard input, and then it's converted to argv, and then we can just exec the real pseudo binary with those arguments now. So this is an easy way to convert this AFL crash that we found to arguments and call the real pseudo binary. And because, you know, right, the first test you saw up here was with the AFL instrumented pseudo binary, and I wanted to do a sanity check. Does it also crash real pseudo? And that's why I used the simple wrapper script to call real pseudo. Is it a dedicated server or virtual? In this case, it's actually a dedicated server. It's a server from Hetzner, from the server Börse. You know, I wanted to try that out. Usually I always click like virtual servers, but because I thought I want to run this for a longer time and kind of as a fuzzing experiment, I decided to check that out. But have you considered instrumenting sudo with azan? Yes, but it will happen later in the series. I actually, so fuzzing with azan, I don't remember right now if I will do that soon. I think I will do this later at the end, because now we found the crash, so it's not really relevant. It's more like for exploring it again late, you know, after we have done everything, testing out a bit different fuzzing strategies. This is when then the azan fuzzing comes into play. But spoiler alert, we are using azan soon to analyze this crash. Please, for now I want to focus on questions and stuff related to this video, and we can do generic questions after the video. So sorry if I'm not... yeah, Mikey, 65 euros. Yes, it's from the server Börse. It's older hardware that always goes lower in price until somebody buys it. So, you know, it's not latest Intel 12 core. It's a bit older, but still 12 cores, still like good speed, still a lot of RAM, like 128 gigabytes of RAM or so, still more than what I have at home, right? So that's why I thought it's useful. It's just different and stronger than, you know, yeah. And if you go this high core count and gigabyte count in RAM, then also virtual servers get very, very expensive. So yeah, 65 euros I think is reasonable. Or feels, what means reasonable? It doesn't matter, like if you have the money, whatever. But 65 euros was something I felt comfortable with for spending on this. You do not see only the side effects like the malloc crash, but see the real... Yes, this is basically, spoiler alert, that's basically the topic of, I think, next video, maybe, or the video afterwards. How this malloc abort is a symptom of an overflow that happened a lot earlier. So we need to find the real root cause, and that's where azan, of course, is used.
Awesome. Now I'm getting excited, but let's do one last test. Now switch the user to the unprivileged user. Remember, sudo is intended to run as setuid called from an unprivileged user. So let's try this again and see if we reach this seemingly crashing code. And indeed, we also get a malloc error. Perfect. Let's look at this in GDB. For that, I installed the GDB extension Jeff. You can also use pwn debug we used last time, but I just wanted to show another extension. In this case, I GDB debugged the AFL to sudo wrapper, as we need it to properly set up the arguments, and then we pipe in the input. The binary will execute now, set up the arguments, and then exec the real sudo binary. And then we crash. It's not really a crash, it's an abort, it's a forced crash. Apparently malloc detected an inconsistency with the next size and decided to bail out and stop the execution before something worse happens. But this
this is the output of GDB with the Jeff extension, so it shows you the call stack. So it shows you the call stack up here in a nice way, and then you can also type up, then kind of like the prompt changes the context on which like stack frame you are on, kind of. I'm not exactly sure what it does, but you can go up the stack frames and it shows you which functions. And here I'm just kind of like looking. So when I look at this, I'm looking for what is the last function that was called by sudo, because this crash happens inside, or this abort happens inside of malloc, and malloc is a library function from libc. So we can see here that there's int malloc, there's libc malloc, and then there's sudo get group list v1. So, all these functions up here are all libc internal functions. So sure, I mean, it's interesting to see like where exactly the reason why malloc decided to bail out. But more interesting is, of course, the last sudo function that tried to call malloc, and that then led to the abort. But it's still not the root cause, it's just a symptom. Something else was corrupted, and when this function tried to call malloc, this corruption was detected.
Still means we should have corrupted something on the heap. So here is the backtrace. Those functions were executed and eventually led to the abort. These functions are from malloc, so from libc. The last function from sudo itself was sudo get group list 2v1. And when we use up to get into that stack frame, GDB can also show us the source code line that caused the crash. And in this case, this function tried to reallocate something, but then malloc detected a heap inconsistency and aborted. This means we did have caused some kind of heap corruption. This is exciting, but we need to understand this crash better. Is this a variant of the sudo edit vulnerability? Or is this maybe a new, different sudo crash? I'm too scared to say it is, because most likely it's not a new 0-day. But the test case did not contain sudo edit. But let's not get prematurely excited, we need to investigate it more.
So this is what I was saying. When I was doing this initially, and here I'm just sharing this in the video. Obviously, at this point of recording this, I knew that is obviously not, but I'm trying obviously to retell it as a story, as if we are researching everything. And so I'm sharing here my experience that when I saw this the first time, I did not notice that there's a sudo edit and a backslash in it. So I thought, oh damn, could this maybe be really maybe an unknown bug in sudo? Could we maybe have found a 0-day? But yeah, it's obviously clear that it will be the known sudo edit bug.
Find the crashing input on GitHub in the episode folder, so feel free to play around with it. Maybe you figure out what happens.
So pause the video now before I spoil it to you. Go, try it yourself. So basically, if you're obviously interested to kind of follow along, this is a good point where you can kind of like start. You can set up the Docker environment, and then you can find here the crashing file, and you could practice now. How can I find the real root cause of this crash? I think this is really good practice, that if you're interested in exploitation, eventually you have to do this, and maybe you're motivated, maybe you're not, but this is an example you can use to kind of like as a challenge to yourself. Let me try to find the real root cause of this, and you can like try out your ideas. Sometimes they can be creative ways to maybe find the real root cause and analyze this. Sometimes, you use tools like Azan or so to figure it out or help you figuring it out. But yeah, this is like could be good practice for you. Otherwise, we will start minimizing in this video, and then finding the real root cause will be, I think, next video.
First quick.
So there's a question: can we report this if we find this sudo version in a cloud company server? Will they allow such reports? Probably not, because those are customer servers. They are responsible for what they do on there. So imagine you are renting, or basically any bug bounty, almost every website nowadays runs on AWS, for example. And so you find a bug in a website. You also don't go to Amazon and say, look, there's a bug in the website, because it's client responsible. The customers are responsible for those machines that they are renting, or the cloud apps and so forth. So it's not, it doesn't make sense to report this to the cloud company. It kind of makes sense if they still offer images of Linux servers that are very out of date and don't have the fixed sudo version. Why don't they, update those? But to be honest, it should be updated if the customer just types in get upgrade, and then it should be probably updated anyway. And maybe there are customers that choose to run very old operating systems for some legacy software. That doesn't necessarily mean that it's insecure or hackable, as long as you mitigate those risks. And if you are very well aware and understand what is vulnerable in these old images, and then you take the necessary steps. And, sudo on there maybe is irrelevant. It just, or what means irrelevant? It might not be that important, maybe. It depends on the context and everything. So yeah, I would say they probably do not want these kind of reports. It's probably an immediate reject.
Quick test I make is to see if the latest sudo version on Ubuntu that has fixed the known issue also crashes. If that's the case, we would know it must be a 0-day. To do that, I take the AFL.
Yeah, so here I do another sanity check. Before I even understand this crash better, I want to see if the up-to-date sudo version on my Ubuntu host system that has the fix already, if that would also crash. Because if it crashes the latest fixed version, then obviously this was a 0-day find that happened to crash the new sudo version as well. If it doesn't crash, it could still be a 0-day. It could just, not trigger the condition on the other compiled whatever. But most likely then it's not a 0-day.
To pseudocode we wrote and use it outside of Docker on the host system. I just have to adjust the sudo binary location, then we can compile it and use the crash we found to execute the sudo wrapper. And we don't get a crash. Aww. Of course I'm hoping to discover a cool 0-day, but it was kind of clear to me it would have been too crazy. So it might be a variant of the sudo edit vulnerability. But still a curious variant, because it seems to not include sudo edit. Remember, sudo shows different behavior when executed with...
By the way, did anybody notice that I'm suddenly look differently, that I'm wearing a different shirt? In the beginning, I was wearing a yellow shirt. Did anybody notice? The reason for that is that I had these episodes planned out and I recorded the footage for it, the face stuff. And then later during editing, I realized that the episode was getting really, really long, like 20-minute episode. And then I realized, I probably should rearrange a little bit the videos. But I know it was like 15 minutes, but cutting it in half would have been like too short. Then it would have been like a 7-minute video and another 7-minute video, or maybe it was a 10-minute video and a 5-minute video, and that didn't make any sense. So there were like 3 episodes that or like 3 or 4, 2 episodes that I think I split into 3 videos, and now I had these awkward cuts where I recorded footage at a different day, and and then it's switched. But yeah, I could have also no, I could have not worn the same shirt. I didn't know at the time of recording that I would do that, so that happened during editing.
Sudo or sudo edit, and you can clearly see that the prog name is very messed up, and the help output is that from sudo, not the one from sudo edit. So this is really curious to me. Anyway.
Oh yeah, so what I'm saying here is that if you look at the help output of sudo, then this is the help output. You see these flags here, -h, -v, -l, and so forth. This is the help of sudo. When you type sudo edit and look at the help output, it looks differently. So I tested this crashing input you have to imagine, like, at the time I didn't know what was going on. I got this crashing input and I tested it against the fixed sudo version. And I thought maybe it's the sudo edit crash or it's a new 0 day, right? So I tried this and it doesn't crash, which is an indication that it is the sudo edit crash. But then the help does not look like the sudo edit help. So if it's not the sudo edit help, does it really execute the sudo edit functionality? So maybe it is a 0 day. It's just, weirdly triggered and maybe it has to be adjusted for the new sudo version or so. But much later, the more I dug into the sudo code, I realized that, yes, when it ends in edit, it will execute the sudo edit functionality. But only when the name is exactly sudo edit, it will display the sudo edit help. So there's just some bad code where the functionality is chosen if it ends in edit, but the help is only shown when the full name is sudo edit. So there's just like a mismatch between two different code parts that decides the functionality and that prints the help. And that's why, and this really confused me for a while. Like, I thought I had bugs and some weird issues why this apparently crashing input was not sudo edit. Like, why does it not show the sudo edit help? But it was like just, yeah.
And we don't get a crash. Aw. Of course, I'm hoping to discover a cool 0 day, but it was kind of clear to me it would have been too crazy. So it might be a variant of the sudo edit vulnerability. But still a curious variant, because it seems to not include sudo edit. Remember, sudo shows different behavior when executed with sudo or sudo edit, and you can clearly see that the prog name is very messed up, and the help output is that from sudo, not the one from sudo edit. So this is really curious to me. Anyway, this test case we have is pretty complex, and probably most of the data is here useless garbage. So I would like to minimize it. Minimizing it can give us a shorter proof of concept crash that's much easier to work with and to understand. In the AFL++ README, you can find a section about minimization of test cases. I have no experience with any of them, kind of want to try them all, but I guess I start with the actively maintained half-empty project from Google Project Zero. To use it, we have to create a small wrapper shell script that checks if the input crashed the program or not. The example checks for the return value 139, which is the value of a segmentation fault. But in our test case, we don't have a seg fault, we have an abort, which has a different number. We can check the return value with echo $? And it is 134, so let's modify the script accordingly. And then we can call half-empty with the minimizing shell script and our crashing input. But somehow it doesn't work. Strategy failed. Try it yourself to verify it's working. Use this command. And I did, and it seems to work. The return exit code of the script is 0. It should work. That's weird, so I give up.
Yeah, so if you look at this code of this little wrapper script, you basically write the wrapper script that checks if the program crashed or not. Now here, this wrapper script looks for segmentation fault, but we have an abort, so we change the return value. And so if we find the return value, then this script has to return 0. If we did not find the abort, we return 1, so that you can clearly decide, okay, did this program crash or not? Did it get an abort or not? So I changed that, and then I tested this because it says here test this. Now, and this test works because if this script is outputting a 0, then it would print, outputting a 1, no wait. Whatever, it doesn't print failed, okay? So I figured it should work, but it didn't work, so I don't know.
The return exit code of the script is 0. It should work. That's weird, so I give up. Let's move to another method. How about AFL pi tmin wrapper? It seems to be a wrapper around AFL tmin. So let's try it. Adjust the tmin path. Let's go. Done. It created an empty output file. Huh? Maybe an empty input file also crashes it? But testing that empty file doesn't work either. Okay, let's just use the minimizer that comes with AFL tmin. You have to give it a crashing input, a location where to write the minimized file, and then the instrumented binary. Now let's run it, and it goes pretty fast, which I thought meant it must have failed too, But when looking at the file with hex dump, wow, it's very clean now. 0 edit and then -s, some characters, and a backslash. This looks like the sudo edit vulnerability. Let's try that one with sudo.
Do you use Ubuntu? Yeah, I often use Ubuntu. I think, it's the easiest to just, I use Ubuntu because that's always what I've been using and so forth. And I generally advise against Kali or something like this. Just install the stuff you need yourself. I think that's better educationally. And yeah, I don't know, it's just easy. I always set up a VM or something. So yeah. Yes, I'm watching my own video and I want to watch the video and then answer questions. So if there are any technical questions, that people have, trying to add some commentary and context to what I was talking in this video, that maybe could help some people. So that's the idea, kind of like a watch party together, but trying to give more context. Now, here's also something interesting. So the minimization is not quite the proof of concept that everybody shared, because the proof of concept was just sudo edit -s and then strings and then a backslash. But if you look closely, there's a backslash and then a 0 byte. So, it's this means it has one argument and then it has another argument with lots of zeros. And it's here the star indicates that there are more lines of zeros. So you have like dozens and dozens of additional 0 as a second argument. And that is a crashing condition. So it's not just this short one. Again, this is something I didn't realize at the moment, but it kind of confused me. I didn't expect this. It was a bit weird. I didn't mention this in the video because it will just be a bit more confusing. Like, what is confusing about this? But for me, it was confusing in that moment. And I later realized it has to do with the AFL wrapper setup, because we are allocating a fixed size buffer. We have an overflow, an override from arguments into environment variables. And so if you have a static buffer that is fixed and your arguments are only this short, you need obviously a lot of text to fill that static buffer. While when you just regular use arguments and just call the sudo edit on the command line, then the buffer will just have exactly the size of the arguments. So it will just be this short, and then your override will immediately go afterwards. Does that make sense?
We can switch to the regular unprivileged user. Then we symlink sudo to 0 edit. Then the program name runs with 0 edit program name. And when we call it with the parameters, like in the input file, keep in mind that here in the shell you need to escape the backslash, it will crash, like sudo edit crashes.
So yeah, here you can see just like how this input file format that is used by the AFL wrapper can be turned into just how it would look like on the command line. You see here 0 edit, and then comes here a null byte. So the null byte is a separation of these, and it's just like then come -s null byte, so it's another argument. Then comes the 0 backslash. You have to escape it here because it's on the command line. Another 0 indicating the next argument, and that's how you just form it. Now you can test it against the real sudo without any wrapper. So now this is like real confirmation. This is like that you definitely did not introduce any issues through your wrapper or anything like this. This is like now pure sudo basically, and it works. So now this is like real confirmation. Okay, this is a legit working real crash.
It's very curious though that just calling 0 edit shows the sudo help stuff, not how sudo edit showing the sudo edit help stuff, but still seems to go into the sudo edit argument parsing code and then crash.
I'm not sure if you can have negative UIDs. First of all, a user cannot control their own UID. Obviously, what UID you get is something root probably can change, decide when you create a user, but I don't think you can do negative UID numbers. So I don't think this is a realistic attack vector. It's not untrusted input. The user ID is not untrusted input into a program, I would think. At least that's my initial thought about this.
We can also play a bit with the name and try different variants, and it's really weird why it works. It's not like the name can be anything, it's weirdly specific to be added with at least one character before it.
I already mentioned in a previous video that there is this check that only compares the end of the proc name to be added, but I only knew this from exactly these test cases, so this is where I learned about this behavior.
Now that we have a minimized test case, we can investigate this further. As mentioned, we are crashing when sudo tries to call realloc. It detects that some metadata value is invalid, which means the heap metadata was corrupted and overwritten sometime earlier in the program. So now we need to figure out where exactly the heap corruption happened. You can give it a try yourself. How would you find the true location of the overflow? Next video, I show you how I have done it.
We're done. Cool. Okay. Any more questions about this video? Or ideas? One thing, I can now let you participate in the joy of being a YouTuber. So when you upload a video, you wanna always check the data. So there we go. So this is the performance of this video, which is actually performing pretty well. Rank 5 of my last 10 uploads and it will go a bit down maybe, but it's a sudo is a very technical, like the sudo series is very technical, very dry. It's not entertaining. It's a series, so you need to kind of watch the previous one. So, this is a series that is not going to be popular on YouTube or anything like that, but it's timeless. It's something that you can watch like 5 years from now, and it will be relevant and have relevant information. I think that's I want to do these kind of videos because luckily I don't need the income, and I mentioned all this stuff previously. I just wanted to share with you and show you. So doing pretty well for a technical video. How many hours did it take the fuzzer to find this crash here? It was like 6 hours, I think. You can see it here. This is original recording of, I was always fuzzing overnight. So I started screen recording with like 1 FPS because, you don't need a lot of FPS to record this. So then the file size was also a lot smaller. And you could see here, I'm not sure when exactly. I think I included here the exact moment when the crash was found. Oh yeah, here it is. So here are the 2 frames. You can see 0 to 1. So it was exactly at 6.5 hours. Do you plan to compare with libfuzzer? I would like to. I think that would be interesting. I was hoping that somebody would show me a setup how to do it. I did see that libfuzzer, OSS fuzz has now sudo included, but I did not look into how they are doing it because it's like arguments, right? I'm not sure, or I was not aware that libfuzzer supports or OSS fuzz supports. I didn't look into it, like how they do it, but that would be kind of interesting to know because I think this fuzzing setup is kind of interesting to compare between fuzzers. Clearly, AFL is not made easy, out of the box to fuzz arguments, but that's fine. I think, getting fuzzers into places that haven't been fuzzed before is the art of fuzzing, kind of. So, if a fuzzer can just be ran immediately on a file, then you oftentimes will not find anything anymore because it can easily be fuzzed before. The magic is getting AFL into a functionality, a place that hasn't been fuzzed before. And sudo is a good example. It's a very easy bug that could have been maybe found through fuzzing, but the problem is that it's not easy to fuzz with sudo, and we have to go through all this trouble. We are now in episode 5 that we set up fuzzing and found it. If it would have been easy, we would have found this crash in the first episode. But we ran into so many issues with the setting, getting a wrapper to work to fuzz the arguments. And that is the difficulty with fuzzing. And that's why I like the sudo example, because it shows you that, it shows you in one example how to get AFL to fuzz something that was not by default intended and is easy to do. And of course, you can now use the same strategy that was used here to fuzz something else. For example, packet parsing. AFL is not made to fuzz network traffic, but in the same way we wrote, or we took a wrapper to create fake arguments, you can make the same thing and now create a fake data buffer coming in from a socket. You just comment out the socket receive and replace it with some kind of wrapper function that reads input or something, So I hope that this way I think that's a lot more educational than just show you download AFL, here's a basic test program, here it works. Like, I think this series shows a bit more, the troubles and the difficulties that you have with setting up fuzzing. And as I said, it would be interesting to see how this argument fuzzing setup would look like with different fuzzers. I'm very curious. So far, I haven't had the time or the motivation to do it myself, so I was still hoping that somebody would just share me, here's the GitHub, here's I set up this fuzzer, and I reproduced the crash with that. That would be really cool. If anybody of you have experience with a different fuzzer, I would be very curious to see that fuzzing setup. Yeah. So this is the first crash, then you didn't realize was actually the same one? Yes, until obviously I did the minimization, and that's when I noticed, oh, it looks very close. But then I was still confused because there were these zeros after the backslash, which is not part of the original bug, but obviously it's so close, I knew this must be similar. But still, the fact that it was not sudo edit but zero edit, that was confusing. But once I saw the minimized test case, I was like, basically 100% confident, oh yes, it's the known vulnerability. But before the minimization, just the crash, I did not know that. Only 6 hours for completely breaking sudo? Well, no, first of all, it can be an hour or it can be 10 minutes if you scale the fuzzing. This was one fuzzer on one core. If you had parallel fuzzing with 12 cores, you would have found this, much faster. If you have a fuzzing setup, how real professional security researchers that really earn their money with this, or companies, they might have, a whole fleet of servers. They would have maybe found this within a minute or 30 seconds. But the difficulty is not the time it takes for fuzzing. That shouldn't be the metric, or that's not the difficulty thing. That can be scaled up. The difficulty is to get the fuzzer in the place to fuzz this in the first place. And the original researchers did not find this bug through fuzzing. They found this through code audit, which is also, I think, interesting to know that this bug is not that easy for a fuzzer to find. Let's say, not easy. It is easy for a fuzzer to find if the fuzzer is set up properly and it's really prepared properly, but that requires a lot of engineering and knowledge and experience already. It is not easy in the sense that you can just take AFL, throw it against it, and find a bug. That clearly is not that easy. So now is the question, are you very experienced in code auditing? Then you could have found this bug. Just read the code, you could have found it. Or are you experienced in getting this fuzzer set up in this very special sudo case? Both approaches would have found it, but what is clear, you wouldn't have found it with no experience at all. It requires quite some efforts to get both sides working. And then both sides were valid and could have found the bug. That's kind of how I think about this and what I kind of take away from it. There's a CVE and sudo with negative ID. Okay, no shot. That sounds interesting. I cannot comprehend how you can get a negative user ID. By invoking sudo with a crafting user ID. So you did not actually... your user doesn't have that user ID. It's an argument that you are passing to sudo that's crafted in a special way. So -u. So that is just regular input. It's just an argument. So, this fuzzer could have basically found this probably as well. So this was just input fuzzing. This has, of course, it's the user ID. That's the meaning of this argument. But you did not actually, have to do anything with your actual user ID. Does that make sense? I think, at least, that's how I understand this. You invoke sudo with this. sudo minus u, you can specify user ID. So what I want to say is that the more parameters we play with, the better chance we have to find a bug. Yeah, absolutely. But the fuzzer is, if you look at the fuzzing wrapper, basically, this wrapper here sets up the arguments. This is completely, it doesn't fuzz a specific argument. It just takes text, any text, really random, and it creates this, these insane.
And of course,
look at, where's the hex dump? Here. These are all arguments. You can see here, minus S, minus G, minus capital A, minus H, minus capital H, minus G. So the fuzzer already generates arguments. So it could have basically also generate the minus U, and then as a parameter for it, or value for it, add this UID. So yes, this fuzzer that's the intention of this way how we are fuzzing. We are fuzzing arguments. We did not hard code the arguments because a bug could also be in the argument parsing. So you don't want to necessarily maybe hard code it. Maybe there would be an overflow bug if you had minus u or something. So yeah, it's completely the fuzzer will just fuzz any, or hopefully find any arguments.